Hello everyone, welcome back to What a Ghoul Wants. For those who are new here, my name is Anna. If you aren't new here, you'll probably notice that my setup is a little bit different, and you'll see I have my little Randy's Rules message board right here. Randy, of course, being Randy Meeks from Scream, and the rules being how to survive a horror movie. And my little TV now reads What a Ghoul Wants. I'm hoping that this will actually help with the visuals of my videos. I have noticed that when I do have the static on the TV, when I watch the videos back on my computer after I export them, they look fine. But it's after they're uploaded to YouTube. I don't know what it is, if the static is like kind of scrambling the image. Like the static kind of pixelates the image. It's very strange. If anybody knows the reasoning behind that, I would love to know, like the technical reasoning. I think that that is the link to the pixelation in my videos, so we're trying this to see. I've tested it and it seems like it should work, so I'm really hoping that that helps with the image quality of my videos. But anyway, on to what today's video is about. And today I'm going to be talking about my journey with horror. So basically like how I got to this point, how I got to doing YouTube and talking about horror movies on YouTube. For someone like this, you would think that they have been a horror lover their whole life. And for me, that's not quite the case. So I'm gonna go back to my past all the way to little baby Anna and kind of talk about where my love of movies started and how I then got into horror later in life. Because I did not start out as a horror lover right off the bat. There are things about my childhood that I can link to transitioning into liking horror, if that makes sense. That is gonna start with my love of Disney movies as a kid and just animated movies in general. So as a child, I was very into Disney and everything about it. I loved all of the musicals and the animation, cartoons, everything like that, everything that kids like in general. And when I was younger, so like elementary school age, I did not watch any horror movies. I was the oldest in my family. Well, I have a twin brother, so we were tied for the oldest out of my siblings. So I feel like a lot of people who start watching horror pretty young usually tend to have older siblings that kind of introduce them to horror and they learn about it through them. And me just being, you know, the oldest in my family, I didn't really have anyone to introduce me to horror movies. My mom really loved Stephen King. She read a lot of Stephen King books, but didn't really watch the movies and I didn't really see her watching them. So as far as the movies I watched as a kid, it was pretty standard. But within those kids' movies, I did tend to like some of the darker elements. So you think about Disney movies where, you know, you have the villain song or there's some pretty scary stuff that happens. There is a documentary called Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, and that just talks about the evolution of the horror movie in America, in American cinema. And in that movie, I believe it's Joe Dante or another horror director.
A lot of, I think, the childhood attraction to horror movies starts with Disney because the scares were always a huge part of what was appealing about Disney movies.
That is talking about, as a kid, liking the darker elements in Disney movies. So he specifically talks about the donkey transformation scene in Pinocchio. And he says, if you liked that kind of stuff as a kid, you'll tend to like horror later on, or you will be more open to watching movies like that, where it kind of has that scare factor to it. And if you don't like those things as a kid, you might not tend to like actual horror movies later in life. So I have found that to be true for me, in that I did like those things as a kid. So movies that I loved that were pretty disturbing when you really look back at them include movies like The Secret of NIMH, with the rats that are being experimented on, and a lot of the characters in that are very scary and creepy and just really dark and disturbing almost. So I loved that movie as a kid. I don't know if any of you remember the We're Back, I think it's We're Back, A Dinosaur Story is the full title. The villain in that being this weird doctor who is imprisoning these dinosaurs, like enslaving them, and all the spooky magic involved in that story. I loved that movie too. The Last Unicorn, again, lots of scary imagery in that. And then movies like Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island and The Witch's Ghost, which are very entrenched in horror, very much so. Zombie type movies and werewolf transformation movies, ghosts and witches, all of that that is all tied together. So yeah, I was just really drawn to those things as a kid, and I don't really remember getting many nightmares or anything like that. So yeah, I just didn't shy away from that kind of stuff. So that kind of primed me to get into horror later in life, even though I never really watched horror movies at a young age. And I hadn't seen, any of the heavy hitters like A Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, Friday the 13th. I had never seen any of those until I was an adult. So I didn't have those to introduce me into the horror genre like a lot of other people do. Yeah, my introduction was more just the scarier parts of kids' movies. So although I didn't actually see those movies as a kid, I do remember being at sleepovers and other kids would do like the 1, 2, Freddy's Coming for You rhyme, or they would talk about Candyman like it was an actual urban legend or myth.
Have you ever heard of Candyman?
No.
Well, his right hand is sawn off. He has a hook jammed in the bloody stump. And if you look in the mirror and you say his name 5 times, he'll appear behind you, breathing down your neck. You want to try it?
So I was introduced to those through that, like through other kids talking about them, and I was very intrigued by them. I just knew that I wasn't allowed to watch those kinds of movies. I just had to go through like hearing about them from other kids. So it's just funny that I never actually saw those until I was an adult. I do have a very strong memory of watching a Twilight Zone episode as a child at a friend's house. It was the Living Doll episode with the Talkie Tina or Talking Tina doll.
I'm going to get rid of you.
You wouldn't dare.
That was another introduction into horror, and it made me realize that even things that are meant for children can be made to be scary, like a doll. So that was another key point in my horror history that got me thinking, what if these things that exist in my life can be scary? Even just watching something that was black and white as a kid, I'm surprised that it held my attention so much, because even just a movie being in black and white as a kid can kind of turn you off. But I was just enthralled by that episode. So I was probably, I don't know, maybe like 8 when I saw that. Another very important aspect of just being a kid growing up in the 90s was going to video stores, and we would go to Blockbuster. We had a local store called Max's Video that I can close my eyes and remember what it was like to be there and to walk through the aisles and see the VHS tape covers, because they were VHS tapes in the 90s still. And then obviously eventually transitioned to DVDs, but I have very specific memories of seeing certain VHS covers that were horror that really stuck out to me and like burned into my brain and got me thinking, what is that about? I'm so interested. I want to watch it. But of course, being too young to actually be able to rent it or have my mom rent it for me. So some of the ones that I do remember seeing as a kid that really stuck out to me were the I Spit on Your Grave cover. Of course, that one is very infamous. And I believe they even had a little sticker that was placed, on the girl's butt, because her butt's kind of hanging out on the cover, and it said something like mature or something like that. So of course I was like, whoa, what does this mean? What's going on? Why is this lady half naked? And her shirt is torn off of her, and she has like a weapon in her hand. What does this mean? Like, whose grave is she spitting on? So that was definitely one that stuck out to me, as well as the cover for May. That one I was like, this girl looks really freaky. What is going on with her? And then the halo of scissors around her head, I was like, what is this about? What is her deal? What is May doing? The Dead Alive cover with the skeleton coming through the mouth and the eyes popping out, that one I was just like, whoa, is this supposed to be funny? Is it supposed to be scary? What's going on here? And then the last one I can really remember is the April Fool's Day cover of the hair braided into a noose behind the girl's back, and she's holding a knife, and you're wondering, what does this have to do with April Fool's Day? Like, I didn't think that was a scary holiday, but here this movie is. So those are all movies that I was like, wow, if I were old enough to rent these, I would absolutely grab them off the shelf and go watch them immediately, because I was so intrigued by the covers. So I was always drawn to these kinds of movies, even before I could actually see them. When I got a little older in middle school is when I really started to actually watch horror movies, and I do have a My First Horror Movie episode on Sledgehammer Horror's channel. Please go check check him out if you haven't already. Go subscribe to him. He's amazing. And he interviews people and asks them about the first horror movie they ever saw. And I was on and I talked about The Grudge. And that is the first horror movie that I really remember seeing. And that would have been probably in 2004 when it came out. I remember watching it with some cousins at a family reunion. And so I was 11 at the time. This was the first movie that really freaked me out. Like, truly, I started to have nightmares and I was paranoid that I was seeing The Grudge in the corners of my bedroom at night. You know how in some of the scenes, the hair kind of spreads out in the corner of the room, and I would be trying to go to sleep and I would look up and it would be dark in the corner, so I would think, oh no, The Grudge is here, like she's gonna get me, or come underneath the sheets and grab my feet or something like that. So I was very, very scared by that. And before that, I would say I had seen bits and pieces of movies on TV, so like movies that would be shown a lot, like The Shining or Silence of the Lambs. I would see bits and pieces of those, but I didn't actually see a full movie from start to finish until The Grudge is what I thought. But looking back, I actually realized when I was looking at movies from this time that Alien vs. Predator came out in 2004, and it came out a couple months before The Grudge. And I remember that I saw that movie in theaters because I distinctly remember it being the first PG-13 movie I ever saw in theaters. So that was actually my first real horror movie, I think. But I don't know, it just didn't stick with me as much as The Grudge, so I still cite The Grudge as the movie that really got me into horror. Yeah, I really need to rewatch Alien vs. Predator because it's been a really long time, although I've heard that it's not great. But of course, you know, as a 11-year-old, I was just like, whoa, I'm at my first PG-13 movie, this is awesome. And I didn't really know anything about good plots or anything like that. So those are some other key points in my like middle school era. Although one other memory I do have of a scene that really freaked me out, it was not the whole movie. I know I did not sit down and watch the whole movie, but Poltergeist, where the guy peels his face off in the mirror. That scene, I was like, whoa, what is this? This is freaky. I do not like this. Looking back, it's pretty obvious that it's not real. It's pretty obviously a fake head, and it doesn't hold up quite as well as in my memory. But when I saw it as a kid, I was like, this really looks like this guy is peeling his face off. Oh, also the steak with like the maggots coming out of it, that freaked me out. So I think that was another one that just happened to be on TV, and I saw that part and was like, nope, I'm not ready for that yet. So I did have some limits, but I would say the older I got into middle school and early high school is where I really started to explore more with like gore and more disturbing imagery and things like that. So I would say most of my exposure to actual horror movies were just from friends, just from people talking about them at school or going over to a friend's house and them saying, hey, I have this DVD, do you want to watch it? Maybe like, okay, sure. Not necessarily me specifically seeking out horror, but just kind of being around it and it being something that people I was around were engaging with. So I was kind of introduced to it really through other people. And then it wasn't until later that I started seeking stuff out on my own. So it was more of like a group activity to watch a horror movie. It wasn't something that I would just do alone by myself at home. So then we get to high school, and this is early 2000s still, the torture era, the remake era of the early 2000s. So this is when I was really starting to go to movie theaters and watching these movies in the theater. And I guess I didn't really realize just how much I would go to the movies as a kid and as a teenager. But when you are in a small Midwestern town and you're under 21, there is not much else to do besides go to the movies. So I would go a lot. And there were some movies that I specifically remember seeing in the theaters and being really excited about seeing in the theaters. And looking back, I'm like, oh no, these were not very good movies. But as a teenager, again, like I said, I didn't really know what made a good movie. If it was a movie and it was in front of me and I was entertained by it, then that made it good. So I was watching things like the Prom Night remake in theaters, the When a Stranger Calls remake in theaters. Pretty much, you know, the scene in Scream 4 where Kirby is on the phone with Ghostface and he asked her to name like horror remakes from that time, and she just rattles off that list.
Name the remake of the groundbreaking horror movie in which the villain...
Halloween, Texas Chainsaw, Dawn of the Dead, The Hills Have Eyes, Amityville Horror, Last House on the Left, Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, My Bloody Valentine, When a Stranger Calls, Prom Night, Black Christmas, House of Wax, The Fog, Piranha. It's one of those, right? right?
That's pretty much the ones that I was seeing. I kind of stayed away from the heavier movies like The Hills Have Eyes. I didn't watch until a little bit later. Definitely didn't see that one in the theaters. So that was still a little bit too much for me. But the ones that I really, really remember liking from that time period were Disturbia. That one I really loved, which is basically like a remake of Rear Window. But The Uninvited, again, another remake of, is it a Japanese movie? Is that Tale of Two Sisters? Sorry, I should have looked that up before, but loved that one. The Haunting in Connecticut really stuck with me. I can just picture like the ectoplasm coming out of the guy's mouth in that one, as well as the box of eyelids. Oh, that was so gross, so disturbing. And then Red Riding Hood with Amanda Seyfried, Seyfried. I feel like I never say her name right, but that one I loved. That one might actually be kind of an underrated werewolf movie, but again, that's one I haven't seen in a really long time, so I'm definitely due for a rewatch of that. But I remember that one I was really into the cinematography of. That was maybe one of the first ones where I can remember being like, wow, this movie is beautiful. It's beautifully shot and the costuming is great. I want to say it's by either the same director or the same cinematographer as the Twilight movies. I could be wrong about that. I'll have to fact check that, but for some reason I was really drawn to that movie. I think it kind of combined my love of fairy tales and folklore with horror, which I do find is something that I really like now, because you can flash forward to a movie like Gretel and Hansel, and it has a lot of similar elements to Red Riding Hood, and I love seeing movies like that, so it's funny that that is one that really did stick out to me when I was in high school. Also, Insidious, which I saw in, I believe it was we called it the cheap theater. I don't know if anyone else has these around them, but it's like a movie will come out, it'll be out for several weeks or months, and then it will hit these cheap theaters where it was maybe, I don't know, like $3 or $5 to see this movie, just a little bit later than everybody else who wanted to see it when it first came out. So I would wait for that for a movie that I wasn't like super jazzed about seeing and go to it with friends, and Insidious was one of those that I saw in the cheap theater, and I remember, I think I fell asleep during that movie and I have not rewatched it since, which is so interesting because so many people love it so much. That is one I will definitely give another chance to, because I maybe just wasn't in the right mindset. At that time, I didn't want to have to like wait for a slow burn of a movie, if that makes sense. I was just like, give me the horror, give it to me now, which is really funny because when you look back at some of those other movies that I cited, like When a Stranger Calls, that movie is so boring. I mean, especially on a rewatch, you're just like, oh my God, there's so much time spent just like looking out the windows or shots of the house empty. So it is funny how my taste has changed over time for sure. So I promise I will give Insidious another shot. So for a good example of contrast of movies that I was very enthralled by and entertained by and that really held my attention, The Collector was probably my most watched horror movie in high school. I watched it, gosh, I don't know, 7 times or something within a couple years, and it's one I can distinctly remember watching with friends, but also liking it enough to be like, I just want to watch this by myself. And having the booby traps and the masked killer and kind of an anti-hero as our lead. Yeah, everything about that I was just so in on. I still cite it as a pretty underrated movie. I would say, obviously, it was very inspired by Saw and Hostel and all of those movies that came before it, but in high school, if you asked me what my favorite horror movie was, I would have said The Collector. That is another one that I have not seen in quite a while. I think I kind of burnt myself out on it, so I will say I do have to rewatch it to say if it actually is underrated or if I'm just building it up in my memory and it's not quite as good as I remember. But yeah, teenage Anna was obsessed with The Collector. So then we move on to college, and during this time I was pretty busy, as you are in college. You know, I was working multiple jobs, I was going to school full time, and I just didn't watch as many movies. There wasn't time to do it. If I did, it was in my dorm room with friends, and that usually did not involve horror movie. That was movies like Bridesmaids or Mean Girls, you know, stuff like that. So it wasn't that I shied away from horror, I just think I really didn't have time to watch much. And the last one I really remember watching at the very beginning of college was The Cabin in the Woods. I definitely saw that in theaters, and I remember it really sticking out in my mind and being something really special and unique. But other than that, I cannot think of many horror movies that I saw in theaters at all. So that was kind of a break period for me. But at that time, I was taking film classes. I took several classes about film, and I really discovered my love for film, and learning about the technical aspects and film history was so interesting to me. Really digging into more classic movies that I hadn't been exposed exposed to yet. I am really glad that I was able to take these classes and learn more about films in general, and I think it really helped grow my love of the art of film and gave me the tools to kind of dissect films more and learn more about plot structure and character development and cinematography and all of that. So I am so glad that I was able to do that in college and to expand my knowledge about film and just being able to have a more critical analysis of movies. I think it's really benefited my experience of watching movies because I just have a better understanding of how they're made, what goes into it, and also just the history behind it. And subsequently that got me reading more about film theory and stuff like that. So after graduating college, I had a little bit of a lull again. I moved twice in a 3-year period, and in that time I don't remember much about the movies I was watching, but it wasn't until about 2017, 2018 that I really rediscovered my love of horror. And this is when I was really getting into podcasts. Podcasts are more of a thing, and I was listening to horror movie podcasts that would go into depth about the movies and really break them down and talk about meaning and metaphor and theory behind them. And I got really into that kind of stuff. Faculty of Horror is a huge podcast for me. I love them and I still listen to them to this day. And it got me really digging in deeper to people that write about horror movies and horror sites like Bloody Disgusting and Dread Central. Hearing other people's thoughts about the genre and people that were so knowledgeable and who have dedicated their whole lives to studying the genre of horror. And it really made me realize that being a horror lover can go a lot deeper than just watching the movies. You can dig deeper into them and get a lot of meaning out of them, and it can connect to your life in different ways and make you think about the world in different ways. And of course, there's still entertainment. There's still something that you love to watch, but the enjoyment can go so much deeper than just the surface level. And I really discovered that in the past 5 years, I would say. And I started learning about people like Carol Clover, Kayla Janice, and all these people who have written critically about horror movies and digging into like gender theory and queer theory and all this kind of stuff that makes you realize that horror movies are a mirror of society and a reflection of things that real people deal with all the time. It can be an allegory for coming of age or sexual awakening, your relationship to religion or culture or race. It's just so complex, and that's why it really irks me, and it irks a lot of horror fans when people say that the genre is just about slicing and dicing and gore and boobs. They take it at such a surface level where they don't understand just how complex the genre is and just how much of an impact it can make for the people that watch it. That's something that I hope that people can take away from my channel, is seeing that there is so much more to horror than just the blood and guts. It can really become a part of your life and make you think about these different issues. So that is something I'm so glad to have discovered in the past few years. So in 2018, 2019, I really started to go back to theaters and watching horror movies in the theater, you know, of course, until COVID hit, but that was when I was discovering Jordan Peele and A24 movies and things like that. And this is also when I started getting into more obscure horror, watching more B movies. Of course, it's helped by the accessibility of these movies on streaming services. So that I am so grateful for, that I have so much more access to movies that I wouldn't have had access to as a kid. And you hear about all of these movies where people that found them in the 80s and 90s had to go through all these weird channels to get them on a VHS tape sent from a guy who lives across the country or in a different country completely because you heard about it from a friend and so you wanted to see it. And I'm just so grateful that we are able to watch these movies just in the comfort of our own homes at the click of a button. I know it's a different experience, and a lot of people do miss that hunt and the thrill of actually finding the VHS tape or the DVD that you want to watch. And there are definitely still some movies out there like that aren't on streaming. But I just think it's really cool that a lot more people have access to horror now because of Shudder and Netflix and, you know, all of these things. So, and just the advent of the internet too, of course. That obviously helped people be able to access these films and to connect with other people that love horror as well. I would say creating my horror Instagram a few years ago is one of the best things I could have done for making friends and meeting new people who share this love and who want to talk about horror all the time. So I just felt the need to share my love of the genre. I really started posting regularly on it last year. After several months of being entrenched in the pandemic, I was like, I need some sort of outlet. I need a way to connect with more people. And I started posting more on my Instagram and meeting like-minded people. And I'm so glad that I started doing that. That really helped my love of the genre grow even more. And it inspired me to finally create this channel. So in June of last year is when I started What a Ghoul Wants. And I haven't looked back. I've loved every second of it. I've loved being able to share my love of horror with all of you. And I'm so glad to have this outlet to get out all of my feelings about horror and get it out in the world and have other people find it and connect with me and just make a ton of friends who are so awesome. Everyone that I've met in the horror community that I've really connected with. Of course, there are some people that are just trolls or gatekeepers, but for the most part, everyone I've met has been so awesome and just wants to talk about the thing that they love. And even though people disagree, I mean, some people can be kind of shitty about their opinions, that's for sure. I would say in general, people are pretty respectful. So I have been very lucky in that regard to connect with just some awesome people. And I truly feel like I've made some lifelong friends through my love of horror, which is just so awesome. So yeah, that's basically my story. That is my horror story, I guess you could say. My journey from little kid who loves the scary parts of Disney movies to full-grown adult who consumes horror every day, all the time, and basically lives and breathes horror. So I would really love to hear everyone else's stories. If you have some key memories of when you discovered your love of horror, I really would love to know. So please let me know in the comments. And maybe I will try to do a live sometime where we kind of talk about this and have a free-flowing discussion. I think that that would be really fun. And I would really just start to like doing lives in general. My problem is I don't have a webcam. When I hook up this camera to my computer, it's not like a clean feed, if that makes sense. Like you still see all of the stuff that's on my screen, and I don't want you guys to have to deal with that, but I really don't want to have to do it on my phone either. So I'm gonna try to figure out a way around it, but please let me know if you would be interested in that as well. I think that that would be really fun. So before I head out here, I just wanted to remind everyone that right now voting is going on for Horror YouTuber of the Month for the month of March. So I made a video, I will link it in the description, and in it I go over the 4 channels that I've nominated for this award. So please watch that video if you haven't already, see the channels and check out their stuff, and then in the comments of that video you will vote for the horror YouTuber that you think should win Horror YouTuber of the Month for the month of March. So please go over to that video and check it out. You have until March 31st to vote, so you do have some time if you want to check out the channels and really get a feel for everyone's stuff before you vote, but it does end on March 31st. So please check that out and share it if possible. I would love for everyone who sees it to share it and show other people and have more people know about this award and have as many people vote as possible. So if you can share it, that would be amazing. But just checking it out and voting is awesome too. So again, that video will be linked in the description of this video. And last but not least, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you are not already a subscriber. I would love to have you here and just be friends and talk about horror movies. So thank you again for watching. I hope everybody has a great day. Remember Randy's rules, and we'll talk horror next time.